A child stood on an auction block in Savannah, Georgia, on a muggy August morning in 1855, and nobody wanted to purchase him. His pale skin and colorless eyes characterized him as cursed, deadly, a bearer of bad luck that no plantation owner would dare bringing onto their property. $20 was the starting bid, followed by $15 and $10. At last, one woman raised her fan for only $5. 12 miles outside the city, Margaret Denore, a widow with 4,000 acres, donated $12 from what she described as Christian compassion. Her kindness was praised by the audience. They were unaware that Margaret had spent 3 years looking for a child just like this one. They had no idea that over the course of the following 14 years, 73 people would vanish from her property, their outcomes recorded in ledgers purportedly destroyed by local officials in 1861. However, one ledger was unearthed in 1959 while building a highway, concealed in a foundation wall. There were lineage charts, measurements, and a project known as the Purifying Project. I have a question for you before we go on to the tale of what happened to that albino youngster and the secret compound where Margaret carried out her experiments. We solve the secrets that history attempted to conceal, so please hit the notification bell and subscribe to this channel. Additionally, kindly let us know where state or city you are listening from in your comment. Where are these somber tales being heard by our audience? Let me now transport you back to that hot afternoon, when the horrible vision of a widow started to take shape. The crowd assembled near the waterfront slave market was oppressed by the physical weight of Savannah's July heat. Margaret Denore, a huge woman whose bulk demanded attention in a time when such girth denoted riches and power, arrived in her chariot, alone as usual. She had been a widow for 13 years at the age of 47, managing her late husband's plantation with an iron will that alarmed neighbors and overseers. However, it wasn't Margaret's looks or business sense that really made her stand out. It was the library she had put together in the last 10 years. More than 300 volumes on anatomy, animal husbandry, and natural philosophy, with an emphasis on concentrate on genetic science and breeding methods. The crowd fell silent because of the boy's coloration, even though he was probably 11 years old when he was brought to the stage that day, and his ribs were thin enough to show through his shirt. His skin appeared practically transparent in the strong sunlight. His eyes had a pinkish-gray tint that made him appear to look through people rather than at them, and his hair was sparse and white blonde. Cyrus Peaton, a professional auctioneer, found it difficult to conceal his uneasiness. He declared Lot 47 without his customary passion. A male child from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta, perhaps 11 years old. As you can see, he has albinism, a specific condition. Everyone knew the word, even though it wasn't said out loud. Such youngsters were very superstitious in Georgia in 1855, among both the white and enslaved populations. Many thought they were cursed by God, that they could see ghosts, and that they brought crop failures. The blending of African and albinism produced an uneasy ambiguity that challenged the racial classifications that the entire system relied on. Even if European heritage was already prevalent on plantations, not a single hand lifted when the bidding began at $20. Peaton kept lowering it till he got to $5. Nothing has changed. Some made anti-evil signals as they turned away. Margaret's attitude was calm as she slowly and deliberately raised her fan. Everyone turned to look. $5 to Mrs. Denore, remarked Peaton hastily, glad with any bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Margaret stood, opening her purse with theatrical generosity. I will pay $12 for the poor child, she shouted. Taking care of people that others reject is our Christian obligation. A number of women gave approving nods. An old man exclaimed, God bless you. Mrs. Denore, she smiled graciously in response, saying, the very picture of benevolent Christianity. However, as the youngster was brought to her carriage, her eyes analyzed him with the calculating coldness of a naturalist analyzing a rare artifact. At last she had discovered what she required. Her Purifying Project Subject 0. The youngster, who's known by his former owners as Thomas, he was crammed into the corner of the carriage on the way to Belmont Plantation. Margaret didn't say anything to him, but she opened a leather journal and started recording things like his age, the color of his eyes in various light, the size of his hands and feet, and the precise shade of his skin and hair. She went about her work slowly, occasionally raising her head to gauge him with her eyes before going back to her notes. Margaret's driver, Augustus, had been employed by the Denores for more than 2 decades. His jaw was stiff, his shoulders rigid. He had long since learnt not to question Margaret's actions. Belmont was well known among Chatham County's slave population. People went there and simply vanished, not escaped, because word typically traveled about runaways being arrested. As though they had never been born, these folks vanished. In the direction of a section of Belmont that Thomas would soon become all too familiar with, the carriage rolled through pine forest. A group of structures that are concealed almost a mile from the main house, and are only reachable by a little road that winds through dense forest. Between 1843 and 1852, these buildings were constructed with materials that were acquired in tiny amounts from several vendors in 3 states. The laborers who built them had been sold as soon as they were finished and scattered to plantations so far apart that they would never cross paths to exchange tales. Margaret hopped down and signaled Thomas to follow her when Augustus pulled the carriage to a stop in front of the biggest structure. He had never seen anything like the interior. Whitewashed walls, glass windows, and spotless pine floors. Margaret showed him a little room with a bed that actually mattress, a chair, a shelf, and a table with a sink. "This will be your room," she declared in a cold, educated voice. "You will receive enough food, clothing, and shelter. In exchange, you will cooperate with certain procedures, medical examinations, measurements, and observations. Do you understand?" Thomas shook his head and nodded, comprehending only that survival required compliance. "You will be taught to read, write, and understand natural philosophy. These lessons will start tomorrow. You will be able to ask questions about your lessons, but you will not be allowed to ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not try to leave or speak to people without permission. You will be treated well if you comply," Margaret said with satisfaction. "Can you write?" Another shake. When Margaret left, he locked the door from the outside, and Thomas stood still for a long time before he finally sat on the edge of the mattress. He was unable to lie down, so he sat with his back against the door. "If you disobey, punishments will be severe. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded again, his thin body trembling. The wall. Knees pulled to his chest, anticipating what would happen next. Margaret lit oil lamps and opened a journal in the cool basement of another building, dipped her pen in ink, and started writing in neat, precise script. August 17, 1855, Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Preliminary measurements will be taken tomorrow, followed by an educational assessment. Subject 0 is of excellent quality for the purification project, according to initial observations. To her, Thomas was not a person. To her, he was the key to unlocking what she thought were the secrets of human heredity, and she would spend the next 4 years preparing him for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would haunt Chatham County for generations. Subject 0 is the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will be built. If theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of... Margaret had a strict routine that she followed to establish her total authority, and he woke up every morning at 6 o'clock when she unlocked his door. She would enter with a measuring tape and notebook, recording his height against marks on the door frame, weigh him once a week on a scale imported from Philadelphia, and once a month conduct a thorough physical examination that lasted more than an hour, measuring every aspect of his development with clinical precision. Ate cornmeal mush for breakfast, sometimes with milk or molasses added. Margaret had calculated exactly how many calories he needed to grow, and at 7 o'clock his education started. Margaret had hired a tutor, Christopher Vance, a nervous young man from Savannah, to teach him reading, writing, and math twice a week. Vance thought he was taking part in a progressive study to see if enslaved children could learn academic subjects, but he was unaware of Margaret's larger project. She assigned him books from her library, anatomical texts with detailed illustrations, agricultural manuals about livestock breeding, and books on natural philosophy that discussed heredity and variation. But the real goal of his education became evident during Margaret's private lessons. Thomas proved to be an exceptional student, absorbing information at an impressive rate, and by the end of his first year, he could read complex texts, write in clear handwriting, and perform advanced mathematics. In one of the compound schoolrooms, she would sit opposite Thomas, anatomy charts hanging between them, and explain her theories, showing him how traits were passed down from parents to children, showing him charts of horse breeding, and explaining how desirable traits could be concentrated through careful selection. Then, with a tone that never changed, she would move on to human heredity, explaining her belief that races represented different developmental stages, that traits like intelligence and beauty were inherited, and that they could be improved through selective breeding. Thomas listened, his face impassive, his pale eyes fixed on the charts, having learned that interrupting brought scathing reprimands. Margaret never hit him. She didn't need to. The seclusion and complete control she imposed were sufficient punishment. He was only permitted to interact with Margaret, Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who brought supplies but never said more than what was necessary. What Thomas didn't yet realize was that Margaret was training him for a certain role. She was teaching him not because she wanted him to understand what would eventually be needed, but because she needed him to understand what would be required. The compound held others beyond Thomas, though he seldom saw them. He heard voices, sometimes muffled through walls. He saw people moving between buildings under escort. He heard him understand heredity. He understood why certain pairings produced certain results. He understood the significance of her experiment. And when he grew up, he would no longer be merely a subject of observation, but an active participant in creating what Margaret called her improved line. Margaret kept about 25 people in the compound at any given time, though specific individuals changed frequently. She obtained them through a variety of means, buying those with particular characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to get rid of, and occasionally bringing in people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wanted to study. At night, there were occasionally sounds that disturbed him, such as crying, screaming, or long silences that felt worse. He learned never to ask about these things. World. Margaret kept meticulous records of every individual, including measurements, health, family history, and particular traits she considered desirable or undesirable. She arranged pairings with cold calculation, keeping charts that tracked which combinations produced children with which traits. Over the course of 13 years, she had recorded dozens of births, but the records also revealed something darker: a high rate of mortality, particularly among infants, and many disappearances. The truth about these disappearances was perhaps the darkest aspect. When children were born with what Margaret called degenerate characteristics, severe deformities, or health problems, they did not survive long. Her records noted they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness. But witnesses who came forward after Margaret's death told different stories. They described infants taken away shortly after birth and never seen again. They described a small cemetery deep in the pine forest in 1857. As Thomas approached his 14th birthday, Margaret's world consisted of his room, the schoolroom, the examination room, and occasionally the yard where she allowed him to exercise under supervision. They described the copper-lined basement where Margaret kept biological specimens in alcohol jars, including some that looked uncomfortably human. Margaret took care of his health, making sure he had enough food, fresh air, and physical activity. But it was livestock management, not compassion. Lessons took on new dimensions as she started to use preserved specimens and anatomical charts to explain reproductive biology in explicit detail, talked about conception, gestation, and birth with clinical precision, and explained genetic inheritance with increasing emphasis on his unique characteristics. During one lesson, she told him, "You represent something remarkable," her eyes examining him with calculating intensity. "Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive characteristics. If paired with you are not just a subject to be watched, Thomas. You are the key to the next phase of this research." Thomas was smart enough to understand what she suggested, and the knowledge filled him with deep dread. But he had nowhere to run. The compound was surrounded by miles of forest patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he escaped, where would he go? Would an albino adolescent boy in 1857 Georgia go? He would be apprehended right away, sent back, and severely punished. Margaret owned him as fully as she owned her furniture, and the law upheld her unassailable right to do as she pleased. However, something unexpected happened while he was recovering from a severe case of pneumonia in the spring of 1858. Augustus, the driver, started talking to him during supply deliveries. Their exchanges were brief, never longer than a few sentences, and always took place when Margaret wasn't there. After years of isolation and clinical treatment, Augustus would inquire about Thomas's well-being, make comments about the weather, and share little details about life outside the compound. These small human connections had a profound impact on Thomas. One afternoon in June 1858, while Thomas was sitting in the yard recovering, Augustus brought supplies and lingered. "You know she won't stop," he said quietly. "Whatever she's planning, she won't stop. You're smarter than most, though. Her writings have been teaching you. You might be able to figure out something she can't." Augustus hurried away before Thomas could reply, but the words made an impression on Thomas. He had been passive for 3 years, accepting his fate because he didn't see any other option. But Augustus was correct. He could read and had access to Margaret's library. Understood more about her theories than she realized. And if he was careful, patient, and clever, perhaps he could find a way to use that knowledge. As summer arrived and Thomas's health returned, Margaret resumed her lessons with renewed intensity. She informed him that the following year, when he turned 15, he would begin the next phase. She had identified several women in the compound with what she called optimal characteristics, and Thomas would be paired with them to produce children that could be studied from birth. She explained this with clinical detachment, as if discussing crop rotation, as opposed to the methodical abuse of a teenage boy. Thomas listened, nodded, and remained silent, but something had changed behind his pale eyes. He was now planning, not just a passive subject, and as he lay in his room every night, he started to realize that knowledge could be a weapon. Margaret had taught him as part of her. The fall of 1858 brought an unexpected complication. Dr. Harrison Pembroke, a rising figure in Southern medical circles who had developed a fascination with hereditary pathologies, arrived at Belmont on October 12th without warning and carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society of Charleston. He had heard rumors of Margaret's private research facility and traveled from South Carolina to try the experiment. His name was Pembroke, and he was 42. Tall and thin, with angular features and hands that moved constantly as he spoke. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Charleston to start a practice. But his true passion was research, and he showed Margaret his published papers on hereditary illness, his theories about racial characteristics, and his belief that scientific breeding could improve human stock. Margaret welcomed him in the main house, serving tea while evaluating this unexpected visitor. "The future of medicine lies not in treating illness after it appears," Pembroke explained enthusiastically, "but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. Imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eradicated through careful selection, where each generation is stronger than the last, achievable through systematic breeding principles." Margaret listened, quickly calculating. Pembroke represented both opportunity and threat. A threat because he might advance her research and his medical expertise exceeded hers, and an opportunity because he might uncover the full scope of— "Your ideas are fascinating, Dr. Pembroke," she began cautiously, "and I have maintained some observations of heredity among the enslaved population here. Many doctors support eugenic theories in abstract terms, but may oppose morally to their practical applications. Perhaps not as methodical as your research, but sufficient to persuade me that the principles of animal husbandry do apply to humans." With glowing eyes, Pembroke leaned forward. After much deliberation, Margaret said, "Very well, doctor. I will show you my facility, but I must insist on complete discretion. The work is scientifically sound, but the general public lacks the education to understand its importance. You have my word as a gentleman and man of science. It would be an honor to see your work. Perhaps I might contribute observations that could advance both our studies." With solemnity, he replied. Margaret took Pembroke to the compound the next morning. She gave a more thorough explanation of her theories and techniques than she had ever done before as they strolled through pine forest. She detailed 13 years of well-documented controlled breeding, as well as efforts to identify and forecast inherited features. Pembroke paid close attention while listening, occasionally asking questions that showed his curiosity and medical expertise. Margaret escorted him to the building that housed her documents as soon as they arrived at the compound. An endless array of charts, notebooks, and graphs covering more than 10 years of measurements, observations, births, and deaths. Pembroke studied these with increasing interest. "Amazing," he whispered, looking at an 1847 journal that traced a family line back 3 generations. "You have maintained consistency across years. The amount of detail is astounding." He took a moment to read more attentively, but I have to admit that the infant mortality rate, 37% in this group alone, seems rather high. This was what Margaret had expected. "Weak specimens," she said with ease. "Those who have clear abnormalities or constitutional flaws that point to degenerate heredity. For every case, I have kept thorough autopsy records. Even while the losses are unfortunate, they offer important information regarding which traits are hereditary failures and which breed true. Despite the distress that briefly crossed Pembroke's face, his scientific interest overcame his moral reservations as he nodded slowly. And specimens that you have preserved. Margaret kept her collection in the copper-lined basement, which they entered. Wooden shelves were lined with rows of glass jars, each holding biological specimens suspended in a transparent liquid. Pembroke took notes as he studied them with professional curiosity. Most were organs or tissue samples, but several jars held miniature, completely developed bodies, babies who had only been alive a few days, their little faces frozen in looks that suggested they had not passed away quietly. Pembroke questioned, "You performed autopsies yourself?" "I had assistance from a physician in Savannah initially, until he passed in 1851. Since then, I have performed examinations independently. My anatomical knowledge is largely self-taught, but adequate for the purpose more than adequate." Pembroke stood up and closed his notebook. "What you have done here, Mrs. Denore, is a rare accomplishment. The breadth, length, and level of detail are astounding. You ought to publicize these results." Margaret gave a headshake. "Publication is not feasible. The general populace would never comprehend. I'm happy to keep doing research in privacy, adding to knowledge for its own sake." "Then maybe we could work together," Pembroke said. "I may provide medical expertise, assess the findings, and assist in the design of further research. We could make discoveries that fundamentally alter our knowledge of human heredity, if we use the right methods." Margaret gave it some thought. Cooperation resulted in a greater chance of exposure and shared control. However, the prospect of making a real scientific discovery seemed enticing. When she eventually concluded, "Let me show you the crown jewel of the project," Thomas was shown to his room by her. The child was reading from a medical text while seated at his table. He raised his head as the pale eyes shifted from Margaret to the stranger when the door opened. Thomas was still slender at 15, but he had developed significantly. In the afternoon light, his pale skin was nearly glowing and his white blonde hair was cropped short. Margaret declared, "This is Subject Zero," with much pride. "A pure albino that was purchased especially for this purpose 4 years ago. I have meticulously maintained his health in anticipation of the test, given him a thorough education in anatomy and natural philosophy, and chronicled every facet of his development." Phase of breeding. Pembroke gazed with unabashed interest, while Thomas sat there, accepting the stranger's probing hands with passive acceptance honed over years in the compound. He advanced cautiously and spent the next half hour performing a thorough examination. Pembroke used a variety of devices to measure, palpate, and examine into Thomas's eyes. He inquired about sensitivity to sunshine, vision, and medical history. Pembroke was obviously taken aback by Thomas's quiet, well-educated response. "He can now speak thanks to you." Appropriately, Pembroke noted, "and it's an intriguing decision to read." According to Margaret, education has several uses. It guarantees participation by enabling him to comprehend the importance of the investigation. It offers information on the cognitive abilities of persons who are albinos. In addition, when he becomes older, he will need to comprehend breeding procedures well enough to contribute. Pembroke stood up. "Take part in breeding procedures. You plan to make advantage of basically when he reaches the proper maturity, he will be a stud." Indeed, he is currently 15. "In order to create children that can be studied from conception through development, I intend to start the breeding phase within 6 months by matching him with carefully chosen women. Little is known about how albinism is passed down via families. We can ascertain whether it breeds true and what other traits are associated with it by managing parentage and recording outcomes across several pairings." Pembroke appeared really uneasy for the first time. His gaze shifted, from Thomas to Margaret and back. "He's still quite young?" "In the South, enslaved youths his age frequently father children," Margaret calmly answered. "This is not out of the ordinary. Additionally, Subject Zero will take part in controlled, documented breeding for scientific purposes, in contrast to field laborers who are coerced into casual unions. The situation is quite different." Pembroke remained silent for a while. Despite the conflict between scientific fervor and lingering moral sensibility, Margaret had accurately predicted that intellectual ambition would prevail. "What guarantees do I have that my children will be accurately recorded?" At last he inquired. "The data loses a great deal of value if there are incomplete records from conception to adulthood," Margaret remarked. "I've kept such records for 13 years. I don't plan on lowering standards at this time. Every pregnancy will be tracked. Every delivery will be meticulously documented, and every conception will be documented. Here, children will grow up in an environment that allows for systematic observation of development. All of the records will be fully accessible to you. After that, I agree to work with you. I can come once a month to perform exams and share my medical knowledge, Pembroke added. I just want that I be given credit for my discoveries when they are eventually published. On the arrangement, they shook hands. Thomas remained silent as he observed this discussion, fully aware that his fate had just been decided. He lost the one hope he had that Margaret might change her mind or put off her plans. A reputable doctor who not only approved of her work, but also expressed interest in taking part had validated her. No reprieve would be granted. Margaret went to Thomas's room that night after Pembroke. According to her, he thinks a major scientific advance is imminent. You need to feel honored to be involved in such significant research. Thomas said nothing. Margaret went on, her voice tightening. I expect your cooperation. No oppressed person could imagine the privileges you have received. Education, sufficient food and housing, and defense against abuses while fieldwork. I have made significant financial investments in your growth. The moment has arrived for you to accomplish the reason you were purchased. Thomas remained silent. After giving him a quick examination, Margaret walked out, shutting the door behind her. Thomas at last let himself feel the full force of despair in the darkness. He was 15 years old, completely alone and caught up in a nightmare that passed for science. Now the reputable doctor had confirmed all Margaret's suspicions, guaranteeing that the horror would go on and intensify.
However, after reading Margaret's books for 4 years,
learning about her theories and comprehending her way of thinking, Thomas had started to see something that neither Margaret nor Pembroke appeared to acknowledge. More often than not, their lofty beliefs about heredity and their forecasts about the qualities that would manifest in their progeny were incorrect. Margaret's charts revealed unsatisfactory outcomes, youngsters whose traits emerged or vanished without explanation, or whose qualities did not fit expectations. Margaret blamed failures on either hidden genetic characteristics or a lack of data. However, after reading the same books and comprehending the same theories, Thomas had started to suspect something deeper, that heredity was considerably more complicated than anybody had yet realized, and that Margaret's assurance that she could control and forecast it was a lie. This realization offered him a new perspective, I hope. Hope that Margaret's experiment may fail on its own terms, that the results might be so contradictory that even she would have to admit its limitations rather than hope for escape, which seemed unattainable. It was a slim chance reliant on results years from now. However, it was something, and that October night, Thomas laid in his little bed and silently vowed he had no choice but to comply with Margaret's demands. He would observe, learn, and remember, and if he lived long enough, he would ensure that the world was aware of what transpired in this secret location if Margaret's experiment ultimately failed, as he had predicted. On November 18, 1858, Harrison Pembroke made his way back to Belmont with materials, diaries, and medical equipment he believed were essential for what he considered accurate scientific documentation of the breeding period. Margaret welcomed him with open arms, relieved to have discovered someone who fully shared her idea, not merely a colleague. Thomas was ready for Pembroke's arrival. Using breeding manuals and anatomical charts to demonstrate processes, Margaret had provided a clinically detailed explanation of what would be required. 3 ladies in their late teens or early 20s who possessed what she referred to as optimal physical characteristics were chosen from the compound's population. She gave Thomas access to their records, precise measurements, medical evaluations, and family histories. She clarified that each lady will be partnered with him in succession, that resulting infants would stay in the compound for methodical research, and that conceptions and pregnancies would be closely observed. Thomas listened with a deliberately neutral expression, showing no signs of the disgust and fear within. He knew there was no way to resist. Margaret had complete control over everyone in the property, and Pembroke's involvement gave her orders more medical legitimacy. Eliza was the first woman Margaret chose. Her characteristics were described as refined type in Margaret's notes, indicating mixed heredity that was ideal for studying the transmission of albinism. She was 19 years old, tall and slim. After giving birth to a kid Margaret wanted to study, Eliza was removed from Belmont's main plantation and had been at the compound for 2 years. Shortly after delivery, that daughter had been taken away. She was never seen by Eliza again. Although Margaret's reports described her as a docile subject with no resistance, the experience left her isolated and severely traumatized. It was a chilly November afternoon when Margaret took Eliza to Thomas's chamber. After what Margaret thought would be enough time, Pembroke waited outside, prepared to go in. With no more passion in her voice than if she were giving housekeeping instructions to staff, she conveyed to each what was required. She then locked the door from the outside and left them alone. Neither spoke nor moved for a long time. Two frightened youths caught in a nightmare. They stood on opposite sides of the little room. Neither was able to get away. The silence was finally broken by Eliza. "I know you," she whispered softly. "I occasionally saw you through the window." "She imprisons the white boy." "Been here for as long as I have, possibly longer." Thomas gave a nod. 4 years. "What did she force you to do?" "Read her book, study, and get knowledge." He pointed aimlessly at the wall's anatomical charts. Eliza went over to the window. "My child was a female. It's a pretty little creature." That evening Mrs. Denore brought her away. I heard her sobbing in another area of the building for days after she informed me the baby had died. After that I heard nothing more. She spoke in a lifeless tone, depleted by sorrow too great to completely communicate. "Do you believe that infant actually passed away?" Since Thomas was unsure of what the truth might be, he chose not to respond. He instead responded, "I'm sorry." Eliza turned to face him, tears welling up in her eyes. "She owns us and can force us to do anything she wants, so you and I have no options here." It is sufficient to say that two young people deprived of all agency attempted to maintain some semblance of dignity in a completely dehumanizing situation, and when Margaret unlocked the door an hour later, followed by Pembroke carrying medical instruments, both Thomas and Eliza had been altered in ways that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. So I suppose we do what she says and maybe we survive. That's all. Eliza was subjected to an invasive and humiliating examination, and everything was documented in his notebook with clinical precision. He discussed findings with Margaret as if she were not there, using medical terminology that completely dehumanized her. He then dismissed her, and she was led back to her sleeping quarters. Thomas stayed, and Pembroke conducted a similar examination and questioning with him, noting his physical reaction, emotional state, and understanding of what had happened. On November 25th, Margaret and Pembroke repeated this process with the second woman, Sarah, who was 18 years old and had only been at the compound for 6 months. Genetic characteristics. Sarah's trauma showed up as anger, as opposed to Eliza's resignation, and when Margaret explained what would be needed, Sarah flatly refused, her voice trembling with fear and rage. "You can beat me, sell me, kill me," Sarah said, "but I ain't doing this. This is incorrect, and you are aware of it." Margaret didn't seem to be affected. "You are property bought for this purpose, so you have no right to refuse. Your cooperation is needed, so you're going to have to force me." Margaret nodded to the overseer. "Take her to the isolation room. Don't let her eat until she changes her mind." Sarah spent 6 days locked in a tiny basement room without a window, getting only water and one small piece of bread every day. Sarah, weak but stubborn, refused when Margaret asked if she had changed her mind on the second day. On the 4th day, Margaret went to see Pembroke, who described in medical terms the harm that prolonged starvation would cause, highlighting the irreversible harm that Sarah was causing herself by her futile resistance. Sarah sobbed, but she refused to give in. On the 6th day, Margaret adopted a different strategy, taking Eliza to the isolation room and forcing her to explain what had happened, stressing that Eliza had survived, had not been physically hurt, that Sarah was too weak to walk. So the overseer carried her to Thomas's room, where the process was repeated. Pembroke documented everything with clinical detachment, noting that the subject's physical condition was compromised by the resistance period and recommended improved nutritional preparation for future pairings. The third woman, Hannah, witnessed what happened to Sarah and did not resist when her turn came in early December. Eliza, exhausted and broken, delivered this message as instructed, though her voice carried an apology Margaret had not scripted. She obeyed everything Margaret asked of her, her face a mask without expression, her eyes focused on a far-off point outside the walls. Pembroke later noted with satisfaction that the subject showed optimal compliance, suggesting effective conditioning protocols. Thomas spent these weeks in a state of numb dissociation, spending every night locked in his room, staring at the ceiling and trying to keep his mind and body apart to preserve some core of himself that had not been affected by what Margaret had made him do. He read obsessively, losing himself in anatomical diagrams, and whenever he had access to Margaret's records, he closely examined them, observing increasing differences between her predictions and the results of earlier experiments. Margaret, on the other hand, was victorious. She had successfully started the breeding phase with Subject 0, recording every detail with Pembroke's help. She estimated gestation periods, calculated conception probabilities, and planned observation protocols for the pregnancies she anticipated. She wrote lengthy entries in her journal predicting that offspring would provide unprecedented insights into the inheritance of albinism. But nature had its own way. Despite repeated pairings in the following months, Sarah and Hannah's bodies, under stress from trauma and harsh conditions, did not support conception. Margaret attributed this to constitutional weakness, noting it as evidence to support her theories. She did not consider or chose not to acknowledge that profound trauma might affect fertility. Eliza's pregnancy was constantly monitored, with Margaret and Pembroke measuring her abdomen and listening to the fetal heartbeat, recording every facet of pregnancy, and they debated predictions with scientific zeal, seemingly oblivious to Eliza's mounting desperation as her pregnancy progressed. Thomas occasionally caught a glimpse of Eliza through his window, or during the brief times when compound residents were permitted in the yard. Would the child exhibit albinism? What would the skin and eye colors be? In May 1859, as Eliza's due date drew near, Margaret set up the medical room in the compound with more supplies. She had given birth to many babies in the compound over the years, and she approached this birth with special anticipation. Her belly grew through winter into spring. She moved slowly, heavily, her face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, and once their eyes met across the yard, Thomas saw grief so profound it stopped his breath. When the baby finally emerged, a girl weighing just over 6 kg, Margaret's first action was not to comfort the exhausted mother, but to examine the infant's skin and eyes under bright lamplight. The baby was not albino. Her skin was light brown, her eyes dark, and her hair black. Pembroke made arrangements to be present, bringing specialized instruments and promising to conduct immediate examination of the newborn to document initial characteristics. The birth took place on May 17, 1859. Margaret and Pembroke attended throughout the entire 18-hour labor, treating Eliza's suffering as an inconvenient but necessary aspect of data collection. When Pembroke performed his examination, she looked completely healthy and was crying a lot. Margaret's first reaction was one of obvious disappointment because, despite 4 years of planning, carefully choosing, and teaching Subject 0 for this breeding experiment, the primary trait she had hoped to study had not been present in the first offspring. Pembroke noted that the trait was a recessive trait, which, as expected, requires both parents to carry it. The mother clearly does not carry the genes for albinism, so the offspring exhibits normal pigmentation. To isolate the recessive expression, we would need several generations and careful selection. Margaret nodded, already planning the next course of action. Subject 0 will have to be paired with his own female offspring. Once they reach maturity, that is the only way to increase probability of albino expression in subsequent generations. This child will be referred to as Generation 1, Female 1, and she will be bred back to Subject 0 when she is around 15 years old. They plan to take her daughter, raise her in this compound, and eventually force her into the same nightmare Eliza had survived. The realization caused Eliza to make a sound that was not quite a scream. Not quite a sob, but something more primal. A sound of absolute despair that would haunt Thomas, who heard it from his locked room for the rest of his life. Margaret let Eliza nurse the baby for a week, long enough to establish feeding. And then on May 24th, the mother heard this conversation while lying exhausted on the birthing bed. After that week in May, the compound fell into a strange, tense quiet. The sounds from other buildings ceased almost entirely. Even Margaret seemed subdued, though she continued to document observations with mechanical precision, and the infant was removed and taken to a separate room where a wet nurse, another enslaved woman, would provide care under Margaret's supervision. Eliza was returned to the general population of the compound, her body still recovering from birth, her arms empty, her milk drying painfully because she had no baby to feed. What no one knew was that during that week when she was permitted to hold her daughter, Eliza had made a decision that was born of love so fierce that it manifested as terrible action. On the sixth night, when darkness was complete and the compound was quiet, Eliza did something that guaranteed her daughter would never be used in Margaret Denor's experiment. The wet nurse discovered them both the following morning. The details and the method were never documented. Margaret merely noted in her records that the female of Generation 1 had expired due to an unknown cause, and that the subject, Eliza, had been disposed of as unreliable for further breeding protocols. The documents never explained what was meant by the disposal, but Eliza was never seen again in the compound after that day. Additionally, a witness who came forward decades later recalled excavating 2 graves in the small cemetery deep in the pine forest. There were 2 graves that week in May, one larger than the other, both marked with wooden stakes that eventually rotted away, leaving no evidence that either had ever existed. The summer of 1859 brought oppressive heat to Chatham County, and with it came an unexpected visitor who would alter everything. On July 8th, Dr. Samuel Hargrave from Atlanta arrived at Belmont with a young medical assistant named Robert Chen. Hargrave had written to Margaret regarding her research after reading one of Pembroke's published papers that mentioned in passing systematic hereditary studies being carried out in Georgia. Intrigued, Hargrave had written to Margaret asking for permission to visit, and she had granted it, hoping to replace the increasingly untrustworthy Pembroke with a more stable collaborator. He was working with Hargrave on a book on human anatomical variation across different populations, and Chen, who was 24 years old, and the son of immigrants who had arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush before settling in Georgia, approached the visit to Belmont with professional curiosity, anticipating intriguing documentation of hereditary patterns. Instead, what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Margaret gave them the same tour she had given Pembroke, showing them the basement with its preserved specimens, the records room with its shelves of journals and charts, and finally the introduction to Subject Zero. However, whereas Pembroke had responded with scientific enthusiasm tempered by growing unease, Chen's reaction was instantaneous and visceral horror. Chen's face grew paler as Margaret described her methods, including the forced pairings, the systematic breeding, and the high infant mortality rate. "Stop keeping quiet. Mrs. What you describe is not research," he continued cautiously, his voice taut with barely contained emotion. "Systematic brutality is what it is. These are not animals. They are people. Such breaches of human dignity could not be justified by scientific understanding." Margaret tensed, her expression hardening. "You are a young person who is swayed by emotive ideas that are inappropriate for scientific research. These are enslaved individuals who are legally my property, and I have complete legal control over their reproduction. I'm advancing human understanding by using that legal authority. Your ethical concerns are moot." Despite the risk of arguing with a wealthy woman in her own house, Chen calmly said that morality is not determined by the law. Even what is lawful can be incredibly incorrect. "Mrs. Denor, what you're doing here is wrong. This will be severely judged by history." Hargrave made an effort to negotiate, but Chen refused to be quieted. "The use of humans as breeding stock is not supported by any theoretical framework. I've seen enough. I refuse to take part in this, and I strongly suggest that you, Dr. Hargrave, step aside as okay." Margaret told both men to leave her land right now. Within an hour, they were on their way, but not before Chen had a brief but important encounter. Chen strolled down the corridor to Thomas's room as he waited for Hargrave to get his things. He could see the pallid youngster reading at his table through the small glass of the door. Chen found the scene to be really depressing for some reason. He gently rapped on the door. Startled, Thomas looked up. No one ever knocked. He walked warily to the door. "What's your name?" Through the glass, Chen inquired. "Sir Thomas. You've been here for how long?" 5 years, sir." "Would you like to go?" Thomas was unsure of how to respond because the question was so unexpected. Following a lengthy silence, he merely replied, "Yes." Chen nodded, memorizing the boy's face. Chen had to depart after Hargrave called for him. "I will remember you, Thomas. I promise I will remember." The 2 men left, and Thomas observed through the window. He was unaware of the importance of that conversation, but there was a glimmer of optimism in Chen's eyes. On the way back to Atlanta, Chen and Hargrave got into a fight. Hargrave attempted to use scientific rationalization to support Margaret's efforts, but Chen's moral conviction ultimately overcame him. By the time they arrived in Atlanta, Hargrave grudgingly acknowledged that the events at Belmont were unethical, but he would not act against Margaret. Chen didn't hesitate like that. After arriving back in Atlanta, he started sending letters to abolitionist groups, medical associations, and newspapers that described in great detail what he had seen at Belmont. He kept a record of everything. He detailed the systematic exploitation, the forced breeding, the stored baby specimens, and most significantly the preparation of Thomas, the albino kid, for breeding experiments while he was imprisoned in a chamber. Chen was not pleased with the response. Most institutions were reluctant to look into the inner workings of a Georgia plantation in late 1859, when tensions between the various sections were escalating into conflict, particularly after hearing about the astonishing charges made by a young Chinese medical attendant against a wealthy white woman. Although they expressed gratitude for his care, the medical societies did nothing. Because there was little evidence to support his stories, the media refused to publish them. Even abolitionist organizations had little funding, despite their sympathies. Chen, frustrated yet unfazed, took a decision that would ultimately prove to be fatal. Chen returned to Chatham County on December 12, 1859, a few days after the execution of John Brown rocked the South. He don't go straight to Belmont. Rather, he started conducting covert interviews with locals, free blacks in Savannah, drivers, craftsmen, and overseers from neighboring plantations who may have heard tales from slaves at Belmont. He gathered testimonials that supported his observations gradually and methodically. In late December, an overseer from a nearby farm informed Margaret that a Chinese man had been inquiring about Belmont's slave population, which led Margaret to learn of Chen's research. Margaret recognized the danger at once. Because of seclusion, intimidation, and people's general reluctance to meddle with a plantation owner's affairs, she had managed to keep her complex secret for 14 years. However, Chen was a novel concept, an outsider having a strong enough moral commitment to transcend pragmatic considerations, no financial interest in the system, and no social ties to Georgia's plantation society. Margaret's reaction was brutal and well thought out. She could not just take Chen's life. She needed to avoid the attention that his disappearance would bring. Rather, she started to destroy evidence. She sold people to faraway estates where they could not be easily questioned, destroyed journals that contained the most damaging information, and disposed of the most unsettling preserved specimens in order to minimize the population of the compound. But most importantly, she prepared to move Thomas completely, perhaps to her Alabama farm. However, Margaret had committed a crucial mistake. Her longtime driver, Augustus, who had seen 14 years of terror at Belmont and had finally had enough, was overlooked in her rush to remove evidence. In the jungle, Augustus had discovered Eliza and her infant buried. Numerous individuals he had brought to the compound were never seen again. Since he felt he had no other option, he had provided supplies for Margaret's trials and kept quiet. However, Chen gained something new from his research. "I'm hoping someone will pay attention." Through a middleman in Savannah, Augustus reached out to Chen on January 15, 1860. They had a covert meeting at a warehouse close to the docks, and Augustus shared all of his knowledge with Chen. He talked about the high death rate, the forced breeding, the hidden facility, and the forest cemetery with its numbered stakes. He gave information regarding Margaret's tactics and her compulsive record-keeping, including the names of those who had vanished and the dates on which they had been brought to the property. Above all, he created a map that indicated the compound's location and explained how to get there covertly. Chen now had a witness who had spent years within Belmont to corroborate his claims. He had just what he needed to make the authorities take action. He made the trip to Savannah and gave the county his proof. William Pritchard was the sheriff. Chen explained everything. The physical evidence that remained in the property in spite of Margaret's attempts to destroy it, Augustus's testimony, and his own observations. Pritchard found himself in a challenging situation. Margaret Dunor had a lot of money, connections, and power. He could lose his job if he looked into her on the basis of allegations made by an enslaved driver and a Chinese medical assistant that turned out to be untrue or overstated. However, Chen's Pritchard was unable to dismiss the particular and in-depth documentation without being implicated, if even half of his claims were accurate. Sheriff Pritchard came at Belmont on January 23, 1860, with a court order to inspect the compound, accompanied by Robert Chen and 2 deputies. Although Margaret was unable to disobey a court order, She met them at the main house wearing a mask of icy rage. What they discovered there validated Chen's worst descriptions, and she guided them along the winding road through the pine forest to the concealed buildings. There were only 8 people left in the enclosure, and they all looked terrified and undernourished. With ash still apparent in the fireplace where Margaret had burned journals, the records room had been mostly cleared out. She hadn't ruined everything, though. Pembroke's meticulous medical records were still in existence, clinically accurately recording forced couplings and pregnancy observations. Dozens of preserved items, including several that were obviously human children, were still in the basement. Most incriminating of all, they discovered 15-year-old Thomas chained in his chamber and able to describe exactly what had happened to him over the previous 5 years. Pritchard felt appalled. He had anticipated discovering proof of severe treatment, maybe some dubious breeding methods, but nothing had prepared him for Margaret's experiment's methodical approach. He ordered the complex shuttered and put Margaret under house arrest, while formal accusations were pending. While officials assessed their legal standing, the 8 surviving occupants were taken out and temporarily housed in the county poor home. Thomas was given the court's protection due to his special circumstances and capacity for testimony. Margaret's reaction was quick and always well considered. She employed the top attorneys available, men who had developed careers protecting plantation owners against cruelty charges. They had a straightforward plan. Under Georgia law, what Margaret had done was permissible. People in slavery were considered property. Owners had complete control over how they were treated, raised, and housed. Margaret was expressly authorized by law to carry out all of the actions Chen and Pritchard accused her of. As a property owner, she was legally entitled to the medical trials, forced breeding, and even the high baby mortality rate. It was a likely successful defense. Even if a wealthy white woman's activities were technically permissible in 1860 Georgia, no jury would find her guilty, regardless of how immoral they were. Chen was aware of this. Pritchard was aware of this. Margaret's attorneys were aware of this. Most likely, the lawsuit would be dropped before it even went to trial. Then, however, an unforeseen event occurred that altered everything. The doctor who had worked with Margaret for more than a year, Harrison Pembroke, stepped forward. He had been a heavy drinker in Charleston, driven by guilt over his involvement in the experiment. Something shattered inside him when he heard about the probe. Pembroke visited Savannah on February 8, 1860, and gave testimony that supported Chen's charges in every way. More significantly, his testimony was more credible than Chen's and Augustus's since he was a well-known white doctor. Pembroke went into extensive detail about the forced pairings. Dates, names, and particular medical findings were given by him. He expressed deep regret and acknowledged his own involvement. He made it very evident that what transpired at Belmont was systematic violence masquerading as science rather than valid study. His testimony was heartbreaking, and the court found it difficult to ignore. Pembroke's testimony strengthened the case against Margaret by adding to the body of evidence. However, Margaret's attorneys changed their approach. They maintained that even in the event that all of the accusations were accurate, Georgia law would not consider it a crime. They were about to submit motions to have all charges dropped when unanticipated circumstances outside of Chatham County stepped in. The inquiry revealed something even more unsettling, just when we believed we had a complete picture of Margaret Dunoir's experiments. This is the turning point if you have been following this sinister journey into one of Georgia's most repressed historical atrocities. If this tale has kept you on the edge of your seat, hit the like button. Give it to a person who enjoys real historical mysteries, and confirm that you have subscribed in order to avoid missing the ending. Let me now tell you how, although not in a fashion that would result in true justice, the truth concerning Belmont was eventually revealed. Chen made one more attempt to reveal the whole extent of the Belmont atrocities in March 1860, while Margaret's attorneys negotiated the dismissal of all charges. He had been looking into a recurring question that no one had sufficiently addressed. What became of everyone who vanished from the compound over a period of 14 years? A cemetery with numbered wooden stakes had been mentioned by Augustus in the forest, but he had never been permitted to approach it closely enough to count the number of graves. March Chen, Sheriff Pritchard, and 2 deputies searched the pine forest behind the compound on the 14th of 1860 until they located the cemetery that Augustus had mentioned. They found something much worse than anyone had anticipated. Although most of the wooden stakes had rotted away, A thorough inspection of the ground showed that there were at least 47 distinct grave sites. In a secret cemetery, 47 people are interred in unmarked graves. Their names were never listed in any official document, and their deaths were never reported. Pritchard directed the excavation of multiple tombs to ascertain the cause of death. They discovered something terrible. There are several baby remains, some of which appear completely healthy while others exhibit physical abnormalities. According to forensic analysis, a number of adult remains appeared to have died from malnourishment or an untreated illness. Worst of all, 3 adult remains with fractured skulls, broken bones that had never healed, and injuries that could not have been accidental were found. Everything changed with this discovery. Margaret could argue that breeding enslaved people was legal, that high infant mortality was unfortunate but not criminal. But murder was murder, regardless of the victim's legal status. The evidence of violence in those graves suggested that some people in the compound had not simply died from neglect or harsh conditions. They had been killed. When confronted with this evidence, Margaret maintained that she had no knowledge of any violence. She claimed that if anyone had been killed, it must have been the work of overseers acting without her authorization or conflicts among the enslaved people themselves. Her lawyers argued that without witnesses or documentation, proving Margaret personally committed or ordered any killings, the murder charges could not be sustained. But Margaret had not accounted for one person. Hannah, the third lady, forced a couple with Thomas, who had survived the experiment by absolute surrender. Hannah had been one of the 8 people removed from the property when it was closed. She had remained silent throughout initial questioning, shocked and afraid. But when she learned about the graveyard and the signs of violence, something shifted in her. On March 22, 1860, Hannah came forward with testimony that would eventually break down Margaret's legal defenses. Hannah recalled witnessing Margaret directly delivering poison to an infant who had been born with serious defects. She recounted seeing Margaret strike a lady who had refused breeding protocols, beating her with such force that the woman fainted and never regained consciousness. She described Margaret ordering an overseer to dispose of a man who had gotten too unwell to be suitable for breeding experiments. Hannah gave dates, names, and detailed facts that could be validated against the cemetery locations and Margaret's remaining records. Hannah's testimony was given at significant personal risk. As an enslaved woman testifying against a white property owner, she had no legal standing in Georgia courts. Her testimony would typically be inadmissible, but the circumstances were unusual enough, and the physical evidence compelling enough that the judge allowed her testimony to be placed into the record, though he made plain it could not alone sustain a conviction. Margaret's lawyers attacked Hannah's credibility brutally, stating that enslaved people often lied to harm their owners, that Hannah's evidence was driven by bitterness over being used in breeding experiments, that nothing she said could be trusted. The court struggle dragged through March and into April 1860, with both parties marshaling evidence and expert testimony. And then on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. Within weeks, all emphasis in Georgia went to the war effort. Margaret's case, which had been slowly grinding through the court system, was indefinitely postponed. Sheriff Pritchard was called up for military service. The court presiding over the case departed to act as a military advisor. As employees enlisted or ran away, the county records office, which had been gathering evidence, closed. Margaret, who was no longer being prosecuted but was still under house arrest, saw an opening. She sold Belmont to a group of Savannah investors in June 1861, stating that she had to move for health concerns. All of the property was up for sale, with the exception of the compound buildings, which Margaret had discreetly demolished in April and May, spreading the evidence throughout the land, burying what could be buried and burning what could be burned. The compound did not appeal to the buyers. All they desired was the fertile fields. Margaret moved to Alabama, to a modest estate close to Mobile, and vanished from view. Her last known sighting was in 1863, when a neighbor claimed to have seen a hugely obese woman living alone in a dilapidated home outside of Mobile. Nothing after that. She might have moved further west, perished during the war, or perhaps disappeared into the turmoil of a dissolving Confederacy. There was never a death certificate submitted. There was never a grave identified. After 1863, Margaret Denore just vanished from all official records. The youngster who was the focus of Margaret's experiment, Thomas, met a different end. He was under judicial protection when the compound was shut down in January 1860. feeling personally accountable for Thomas's well-being. Robert Chen made arrangements for him to be temporarily lodged with a Quaker family in Savannah, who volunteered to look after him while the case was being handled. The Quaker family opposed slavery. Thomas stayed with this family once the war began and Margaret's case was put on hold. The Quakers, Daniel and Abigail Hargrove, showed Thomas true kindness for the first time in his life, since being sold when he was 11 years old. Most significantly, they treated him like a human being rather than a specimen, maintained his schooling, and taught him useful skills. Thomas had gained his freedom when the Emancipation Proclamation was released in 1863. Thomas stayed with the Harrow family during the war and Reconstruction. Despite the difficulties of freedom for a 17-year-old albino child in the middle of a conflict zone, he became proficient enough to sustain himself after learning carpentry. He married Rebecca Williams, a free woman of color, in 1869 when he was 23 years old, and the two of them had 3 kids. Not a single youngster displayed albinism. They all lived to adulthood and were in good health. For more than 30 years, Thomas lived a quiet life as a carpenter in Savannah, and he seldom ever talked about his time at Belmont outside of his wife, whom he had total faith in. Despite continuing to practice medicine, Robert Chen was profoundly altered by his time at Belmont. He gave from studying anatomical diversity to concentrate on public health, trying to enhance health care for Atlanta's underprivileged neighborhoods. He and Thomas corresponded for more than 20 years. Additionally, he wrote a great deal about the ethical obligations of doctors and the perils of using science to justify cruelty in his private notebooks. At age 57, he passed away in 1892. What he had witnessed in that facility still haunts him. Harrison Pembroke's shame for taking part in Margaret's research never went away. Despite his heavy drinking and declining mental state, he continued to practice medicine in Charleston. He left a note detailing terrible misdeeds committed in the service of science when he overdosed on laudanum and committed suicide in 1867. The court was intended to seal his Belmont medical notes, which had been used as evidence in Margaret's case, but they were never put back into the court files. Sometime during the tumult of Reconstruction and conflict, they vanished. Augustus lived till 1879. He was the driver who had finally spoken up and given the testimony that sparked the investigation. After the war, he continued to work as a freight truck in Chatham County. He had a reputation for being silent, depressed, and hardly ever smiling, as though he was always carrying a burden. He was about 60 years old when he passed away. His tomb was marked by a plain stone that offered little indication of the bravery required to confront Margaret Dunor. The 8 individuals that were taken out of the compound in January 1860 had different outcomes. During the war years, some people perished. A few vanished into the tumult of Reconstruction. Hannah was one of at least 2 who continued to reside in the Savannah region until the 1870s. Hannah never got married and didn't have any kids. She lived alone and worked as an heiress, renowned in her community for being a caring person to kids while appearing to be depressed all the time. When she passed away in 1876, she requested to be buried at a Savannah Free Black cemetery under her given name, Hannah Freeman. The inscription may still be seen on her gravestone. What should have killed her, she survived. Between 1861 and 1959, the land on which Belmont stood was owned by several different people. In 1883, the main house burned because unknown. The land was utilized for farming, cutting timber, and for a short time as a hunting preserve. Most people had forgotten about the complex location deep in the pine forest. Over the cleared spaces, trees grew. The wooden posts in the cemetery had long since rotted away, making it impossible to tell it apart from the surrounding forest floor. The state of Georgia authorized the building of a new highway through the former Belmont property in 1959, while construction workers located the foundation of one of the compound buildings during the first surveying in March 1959. They discovered a leather-bound journal, extraordinarily well preserved because it was totally sealed off from air and moisture, inside a walled chamber in the foundation wall. One of Margaret Dunor's purifying project documents was the journal. Instead of being burned, it had been concealed, maybe as insurance or just by accident during Margaret's hurried 1861 disposal of the evidence. The journal, which ran from 1855 to 1859, included thorough accounts of Thomas's purchase, upbringing, and eventual application in breeding trials. It contained measurements, observations, forecasts, and descriptions of the forced pairings that were eerily clinical. The journal was given to the County Historical Society by the construction workers who discovered it. They didn't know what they had found. When the personnel of the Historical Society first read it, they were appalled. After speaking with state officials, the notebook was ultimately given to the Georgia State Archives. The journal's contents were briefly examined by contrasting them with information from censuses, other historical records, and court papers from the 1860 case against Dunor, Margaret. Everything in the journal seemed genuine according to the examination. The dates corresponded to known occurrences. The names listed in the court documents corresponded to those mentioned in the journal. The compound's physical characteristics matched the foundation remnants discovered during highway building. However, the inquiry also turned up some unsettling information. Even after the war, there had been a concerted attempt to keep the Belmont case under wraps. The court documents from Margaret's prosecution in 1860 had been. Some records appear to have been purposefully taken, rather than lost to military action. But others were allegedly partially destroyed during the battle. Even though the case involved spectacular accusations against a wealthy plantation owner, there was very little information about it in Savannah newspaper records from 1860. Even after Margaret's escape, it seemed that the wealth and power of her family had been used to keep the public from learning about what had transpired. Citing privacy concerns and the delicate nature of the content, the Georgia State Archives prohibited public access to the journal for 10 years, until 1969, while classifying it as a historically significant document. When researchers were eventually able to access it in 1969, it attracted focus from historians researching eugenics, medical ethics, and slavery in post-Bellum America. Margaret's experiment was examined in a number of scholarly articles that examined how eugenics was practiced in the antebellum South. The story served as a teaching tool in medical ethics classes, highlighting the perils of using science to justify cruelty. However, it was mostly disregarded in popular historical accounts. It was too uncomfortable, too complex, and too upsetting to be confined to oversimplified tales about antebellum Georgia. News reports in 1969 informed Thomas's ancestors, who were still residing in the Savannah region, about the journal's discovery. Thomas lived long enough to witness the birth of his grandkids and the growth of his children, before passing away in 1902 at the age of 56. Rebecca, his wife, had informed their kids some of what had happened at Belmont, but she had shielded them from the worst parts. Thomas's grandkids, who were in their 50s and 60s when the journal was made public, finally realized the extent of what their grandfather had gone through. After much consideration, the family opted not to discuss their involvement in the case in public. They were founded in Savannah, had prospered despite the obstacles African Americans in the Jim Crow South had to overcome, and were afraid that being linked to such a well-known case might draw unwelcome attention or cause them harm. They did not participate in public discussions of the Belmont case, but they did preserve intimate family knowledge of Thomas's past. The freeway was still being built in spite of the revelation. Archaeologists recorded the foundations of the compound, which were later demolished to create room for the road. The cemetery area was more fully dug and was located within the highway right-of-way. In the end, the remains of 61 people, including adults and children of all ages, were recovered. A stone that reads, "All were re-earied in a single plot in a Savannah cemetery, in remembrance of the Belmont plantation victims of 1842-1860. May they never be forgotten, and may they rest in peace." This enigma demonstrates how institutions can fail to protect the most vulnerable, how legal authority can be used as a weapon against the weak, and how scientific terminology can be exploited to excuse extreme cruelty. The experiment conducted by Margaret Dunor was not an anomaly. It was a severe illustration of the attitudes and behaviors that were common in her era. The notion that individuals held in slavery might be considered property, that reproduction could be managed and controlled, and that scientific any means was justified by advancement. Margaret wasn't the only one with these thoughts. Her case was unique simply because it was methodical and ultimately revealed. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think Margaret Dunor got away with it? Or did she feel compelled to what happened to her after 1863? Comment here and share your thoughts. Ideas. If you enjoyed this story and would like to read more sinister historical mysteries like it, please Please subscribe to press the alert button and forward this video to a person who enjoys enlightening tales, the most horrific periods in American history. I appreciate you listening and keep it in mind. Real-life horrors are frequently the most horrifying. I'll see you in the upcoming video.